Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's good to see a good crowd here again. Uh, my name is Neil Witte, and I am here to talk about beer with you. This is I'm sorry, I was about to say ninth. It's actually the 10th Certified Beer Server Prep Talk from the Cicerone Certification Program. I'm Master Cicerone Neil Witte, and we are going to talk today about British and Irish beer styles. So, if you haven't been here before, here's a little bit about what we're doing. This is a 12 session series of informational videos designed to help you boost your beer knowledge and prepare you to take and pass the Certified Beer Server exam. That's our first level of examination at the Cicerone Certification Program. This is number 10 in that series, so we've got a whole bunch of these that we've already done. If you happen to miss them, all of them can be found on the Cicerone YouTube channel. You're on the YouTube channel right now if you're listening, so you can find all of those videos posted for you to review. Go back and check them out if you haven't already. If you were here on Tuesday for the session on German and Czech beer styles, thank you for coming back. We've been doing these every Tuesday and Thursday at 1 p.m. Central Time, and we're going to be wrapping up next week. We've only got 2 more after this one. So next Thursday, May 28th, is going to be our last one. But again, these are going to be living on the Cicerone YouTube channel for a while as videos for you to access whenever you want. So go ahead and hit subscribe on that button and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can access all kinds of other cool Cicerone content there as well. So I also want to remind you that if you are a Spanish speaker and you'd like to hear these classes in Spanish, Chema Mora, our business development manager for Latin America, is doing this same series. He's a few sessions behind me, but he's doing the same series on Mondays and Fridays at 1 p.m. Central on the Cicerone Facebook page, and he's doing those all in Spanish. So go ahead and check that out if that works better for you, or watch them both if you speak Spanish and English. Yeah, I want to tell you about a couple other things related to this. For each session we're doing, we have some review questions that we've created that are designed to help you study along and study along with me as I'm talking, or possibly quiz yourself after the session is over, quiz your friends, and at the beginning of the next session, we will post the answers to those questions. So go ahead and download those. You can find those on our Cicerone blog. The Cicerone blog can be found at the cicerone.org website. On the main page, at the top of the page, there's a link to the blog. There's also I see right now in chat, they've posted a direct link to that blog. So go ahead and download those questions, follow along, quiz yourself afterwards, and at the beginning of next Tuesday's session, we'll post the answers. So if you downloaded the questions for the last one on German beer styles on Tuesday, those answers, those questions are now posted at that same blog site. So go ahead and check that out. Another cool thing we're doing is we are giving away 10 free certified beer server exams today. We've been doing 10 free certified beer server exams every session we do. So we've given away 90 of these so far. This is a $69 value. It's really easy to enter. All you have to do is fill out a short questionnaire that we're going to post in the chat at the beginning of the question and answer session today. So click on that link, fill out the questionnaire, and you'll be entered to win. But don't wait, because that link isn't going to stay up forever. We're going to keep it up for about an hour and a half. And so it'll be up. They usually take it down about 3 p.m. Central Time. Fill fill it out relatively promptly, and be entered for a chance to win an exam. Keep in mind that if you are already a certified beer server, if you've taken and passed the exam, please don't fill out the questionnaire and enter to win, because we want those examinations to go to people who haven't already taken and passed that exam for obvious reasons. And at the same time, if you are one of our previous 90 winners, please don't enter again because you can't win twice. So I will remind you at the beginning of the question and answer session to look for the link to that questionnaire when we get to that point. And as an extra reminder, when you do fill it out, make sure that you type in your email address correctly. We've had 1 or 2 emails bounce for people who were going to win, but they didn't enter their email address correctly. We have no way of alerting you other than the email address. So type it in right if you want to actually win the prize. So right now, I'm going to announce the winners from Tuesday. I've been doing this every session, first names only. So here's the winners from Tuesday. If you haven't been notified, there's still a chance that maybe you haven't found out and we sent you the email. The winners from Tuesday are Leslie, Dave, Santiago, Nicholas, Casey, Aaron, Jackie, Jose, Pauline, and another Jose. All right, congratulations for winning on Tuesday. We're going to have another 10 winners today, and I'll announce those names next Tuesday. So let's go ahead and talk about what we've got on tap for today. We are going to be talking today about British and Irish beer styles. This is a fun topic, and whenever I talk about this subject, I always start with one of the big heavies of the history of beer in the UK, and that is porter beer. So porter beer has a long and rich history in the UK, and there are a lot of stories about the origins of porter beer, and there's a lot of myth surrounding the origins of porter beer too. So you may have heard a whole bunch of different things about where it came from. Some of the myths include a lot of discussion about a guy named Ralph Harwood of Bell Brewhouse in Shoreditch, East London, whose brewery made a blend of beers that was replicating what the publicans were doing at taverns at the time. Because at the time, it was fairly common practice for tavern owners, for publicans to blend different beers on tap of different age and different strength to create unique combinations. There was a common blend of beers at the point of dispense that was called Three Threads. The thread was a reference to the actual stream of the beer coming out of the tap. And so Three Threads would be a blend of 3 different beers. So although that was common practice, this story of Ralph Harwood imitating this and creating what was porter beer is not entirely true. There's elements of truth in there, but it's largely a myth. So things we do know about the origin of porter beer. Well, we do know that it wasn't really invented by Ralph Harwood. There's reports of porter beer that go back as far as the early 1700s, and in fact, porter beer was the very first industrially produced beer. Heavy machinery and steam power was really in its infancy and was being developed and being utilized by giant factories, breweries were one of those types of industries that made use of steam power. Modern day breweries still make use of steam power. So breweries of the day were some early adopters of some of the early industrial technological developments. And so the Industrial Revolution helped to fuel the growth of some of these breweries that grew quite rapidly in the 1700s. And the popular beer of the day and the biggest beer being produced in those rapidly growing breweries was porter beer. So the name comes from essentially the hired strongmen who carried goods from storehouses to the marketplace. It could be food or other type of dry goods. So those that profession was those people were called porters, and so porter beer was popular with those workers, and that's where the name came from. The one element of truth in that myth that I mentioned before was that early porter was indeed a blend that was produced in the brewery. So typically it was a blend of some different strengths of wort, but more importantly, it was a blend of different ages of beer. So it was very common practice at that time to age beer in the brewery in really large wooden vats for an extended period of time, for years on end. And this was one way of introducing some type of variability to the flavor of beer, really, because you know the malting techniques back then were relatively crude, and and they didn't have all of these different roasts of malt available to them to create all of these different types of beer. So variability at that time in brewing largely came from brewing different strengths of beer and from aging beer different lengths of time. And you could produce different beers by varying those things and by blending different beers together. So this vatting was very common practice. So the beer in these vats that was aged for extended periods of time was often referred to as stock ale. And this stock ale was largely considered to have a very refined characteristic. Knowing what we know now about the conditions of storage of beer and the brewing industry back then, we can make some assumptions about what that stock ale tasted like. It was probably sour. It probably had Brettanomyces in it, so it was probably very different than what some stories might indicate. So the porter beer was a blend of some of this stock ale, and it was blend and the other part that went into it was what they called mild. So mild had a different connotation then. Mild essentially meant that it was fresh beer. So they're blending aged beer and fresh beer. And and so this was the original formulation of porter, and it was incredibly popular. But one of the hallmarks of porter at that time, unfortunately, was inconsistency, even from within the same brewery, because of the inconsistent malting techniques. It was hard to get very consistent extraction from the malt. So from batch to batch, there was oftentimes wide variability in the strength of the beer that was produced. And and so to make up for that, there were often additions made to the beer, sometimes to adjust color, sometimes to adjust the strength or the flavor of the beer. So it wasn't uncommon for a brewer to add something like burnt sugar syrup or licorice. And in some instances, they were even adding narcotic substances or spirits. And there are even stories of noxious additives, things that were making people sick. So there's all kinds of wild stories about porter beer and what types of things were added to porter beer. And again, a lot of the reason for this was because it was difficult to make a really consistent porter beer at that time. Uh, the malt that everybody was using was what was essentially a brown malt. The kilning process and the malting process was done largely over an open flame and the open heat source, and it resulted in inconsistent heating. So that brown malt had some under roasted parts. It had some over roasted parts, and the net result was that you ended up with a brown beer. Um, and so this was really kind of the base for porter beer. This brown malt to brewed to varying strengths, aged for different amounts of time, and blended at the brewery. Excuse me. And and so uh, this continued for a long time. This method of brewing and that formulation. But then in 1817, a man named Daniel Wheeler invented the drum roaster for malting. He kind of borrowed this idea from the coffee industry, and he adapted a drum roaster that coffee roasters were using to produce malt. And this revolutionized malting. So, what they were able to produce at this time was finally a dark roasted malt, a very dark roasted malt that was very difficult to produce previously. Because over an open heat source, if you're heating at a high level of heat, if you're kilning the malt over high heat, you're very likely to incinerate it and burn it up. So it was very difficult to make. But using indirect flame and indirect heating with a drum roaster allowed maltsters to produce what Daniel Wheeler called a black patent malt. So this black patent malt uh, really revolutionized the formulation of porter brewing, because what brewers knew up till then was that using paler malt gave you more consistent extract, but that paler malt wasn't really that wasn't those pale that pale malt that made the pale beer wasn't really what people wanted to drink. They wanted the darker porter beer. And so what they were able to do with the development of black patent malt, they could use a pale malt that had more consistent extract, so more consistent alcoholic content and strength of the beer, and then add a little bit of this black patent malt that gave it the dark color and that kind of chocolatey roast character that people expected from porter beer. And so this allowed them to make a beer now that was very consistent. So the early 1800s porter formulation changed and it became a lot more consistent over the years. Um, Unfortunately, it wasn't too much longer after that before it started to fade and give way to pale bitter beers. But that's we're going to talk about that in a few minutes here. So now, modern English porter, as we have it, is a medium-bodied beer that may or may not have some low to medium hop aromas. It would be English variety, so they have kind of earthy, floral aromatics to them. The range of alcoholic content is 4 to 5.4%, and the malt character would feature caramel, toffee-like malt characteristics with a little bit of a chocolatey roast character. But porter beer, modern porter beer, shouldn't really have a really super sharp espresso-like roast character in the beer. And the bitterness of the beer is low to medium. So, that's that modern English porter is that descendant from those original porters, and that's pretty much what you should expect from those. Now, when porter beer was in its heyday, the stronger versions of porter were often referred to as stout porters. And these beers became popular in their own right and eventually were just simply referred to as stouts. So this is the origin of stout beer. Now, modern day stout has many different substyles, and we've got a wide array of different strength of beer as well. In fact, there are a couple of these stout styles which are very clearly not as strong as even a porter beer. So stout has really kind of expanded as a family to incorporate a whole bunch of different styles of beer beyond being simply a strong porter. And I think the classic example of that stout beer that is actually relatively low in alcohol is the Irish Stout. This beer is typified by Guinness Draught. This is a beer many people are familiar with. Guinness Draught is like that classic example of Irish Stout. So Irish Stout is a relatively low alcohol beer. It's the range of alcoholic content is 4 to 4.5% ABV, but it features a really pronounced bitterness in combination with a very dry malt character that has a really sharp espresso-like roast. So that sharp espresso-like roast characteristic, that is really what is nowadays kind of that defining feature of a stout when you compare it to a porter. Because now that stout doesn't simply mean a strong porter. People often ask, well, what's the difference between a stout and a porter then? And it really comes down. There's a lot of vagueness and kind of muddy waters in the style descriptions when you look at BJCP. But the one consistent theme that you'll see popping up with stout beers is that they feature a sharper, more espresso-like, sometimes even acrid, malty roast character. Whereas the porter beers tend to be more chocolatey and not quite as sharp. So that Irish Stout is a bitter beer with that sharp roast characteristic and a really light body and low alcohol content. So this really isn't that kind of bowl of cereal in a glass that a lot of people might refer to it as. But there are some stouts that are bigger, fuller body beers. One of those, which is a little bit stronger, is a sweet stout. A sweet stout is a beer that has a little bit higher alcohol range. We're 4.4 to 6.0 in alcohol content. And it has that dark roast malt character like we expect from a stout. But this is a fuller bodied beer than the Irish Stout. And it's got a lot lower bitterness. So this emphasizes the sweetness, as the name implies. It's a sweet stout. So it has a different, whole different flavor profile and balance to the beer. Now there's a style of beer that is a little bit of a sub-style of sweet stout, and that's a milk stout, because some people who make milk stouts achieve that sweetness by adding lactose sugar. Lactose sugar is a milk sugar, and it is unfermentable. So when you add it to the wort on the brew house, it makes its way all the way through fermentation without being consumed. So the yeast doesn't eat it. So it's left behind in the finished beer. So the net result is that it's gonna sweeten the beer more. It's gonna make it more sweet. So a milk stout is just a variant of sweet stout that uses lactose for sweetening. So that's a little bit about the world of some of those darker British beers. But I want to talk about some of the pale ones as well. And we can't talk about some of the pale British beers without talking about IPA, India Pale Ale. So again, this is a beer that has a whole lot of stories around it. You may have heard many different stories about the origin of India Pale Ale, and there's a lot of myth. Again, much like porter, there's a lot of myth that surrounds this beer. So IPA has origins in the export market from Britain to the British colonies in the 1700s. So it was big business to export goods all over the world from England to all of their colonies, and the East India Trading Company was the primary exporter in England. And one of the things that they exported as early as the late 1700s was beer. Now, early on, there was a London brewery run by George Hodgson. George Hodgson had an early monopoly on the beer that was exported around the world. And there were all kinds of varieties of beer that were exported. But it was known for some time that adding additional hops to a beer would help to preserve it over a long period of time. Because of the tradition of aging and vatting with porter beer, they knew how hops would influence that. And hops have an antimicrobial content to them. So they have antimicrobial characteristics that help to keep the beer from spoiling. So they had known this for a long time. And so these heavily hopped beers started to really work their way in and become more popular in the export market, particularly to India, because that was a particularly long ship voyage. Um, so Hodgson's Brewery maintained a monopoly through the early 1800s. And in the 1820s, the brewers of Burton-on-Trent broke into the market. And this is where really we start to see where IPA started to really come together and become incredibly popular because the brewers at Burton-on-Trent were producing these wonderfully hoppy beers, and it became readily apparent that their hoppy beers were far superior to the hoppy beers that were coming out of London at the time. And it turns out that this was largely because of the water content of Burton-on-Trent. The water content in Burton-on-Trent is legendary for having high levels of calcium sulfate. And I won't get into all of the details about minerals in water, but high calcium sulfate levels in water can assist in making beautiful hoppy beers. And in fact, it's so legendary that there is still a modern term of adding calcium sulfate to a water that we call Burtonizing. And it's very common when people are making hoppy beers. So this is where that term comes from. So as these Burton brewers broke into the market, in the export market, IPA became incredibly popular and eventually became popular not just in export, but in the domestic market as well. So, modern IPA right now has many iterations, but that classic IPA of the day was a medium alcohol content beer that was heavily hopped and quite bitter, and the export versions would often end up quite dry. Any yeast content that was in there with the constant motion of the ship voyage would make sure that attenuations were very high. So there were a lot of sugars that were consumed. So malt characteristics of bread, caramel, toast, aggressive bitterness, and modern day versions. And we'll talk about American IPA when we get to modern day American IPA. Have big hop aromas and flavors. So over the years throughout the 19th century, IPA really grew in popularity. But near the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, there were a number of forces at work which pushed alcoholic levels down. Part of this was temperance movement. So the temperance movement in the United States resulted in prohibition. In the UK, they didn't have prohibition, but one of the results of their temperance movement was taxation based on alcoholic content. So there was a lot of pressure on brewers in the late 1800s or the late 1800s in the early 20th century to make increasingly lower alcohol beer. And so we can see today the results of this in modern day pubs in the UK. There are a lot of low alcohol beers on tap in your average UK pub. So modern day pale beers, as they developed through the 20th century, evolved into what we refer to generally as the English bitters. So these are beers that today are largely draft beers or cask conditioned ales, and they come in many different strengths. So there's a wide variety of alcoholic content, but they all share some fairly similar descriptors. So they have some sweet caramel or bready or toasty malt flavors. They have a prominent bitterness, but not really assertive, but they balance more on the bitter side. So you get a little bit more of that bitterness in the flavor than you do the malt sweetness. And and then there's a varying amount of body to the beer depending on the alcoholic content. So the way the Beer Judge Certification Program, BJCP, classifies this range of English bitters is into three basic categories. That's the ordinary bitter, best bitter, and strong bitter. And the divisions are along clear alcoholic strength guidelines. And the flavor descriptors are largely the same, other than the body of the beer and maybe the intensity of some of the flavors. So with ordinary bitter, you've got an alcoholic range of 3.2 to 3.8%. With best bitter, you've got 3.8 to 4.6. And with strong, you've got 4.6 to 6.2. So clear alcoholic strength divisions there. So that strong bitter is what is largely considered to be English pale ale, or at least the bottled versions of it are. So that English pale ale or British pale ale would really be the bottled version of that beer, and that's the beer that's served for the inspiration for the American versions, which came, not too long ago, really. And we'll talk about those when we talk about American style beers next week. So if you go a little bit north in the UK, up into Scotland, you've got the Scottish ales, and the Scottish ales can be considered in large part an adaptation of the English bitters, only with reduced hopping rates. So they tend to be more malt forward. Hops don't grow quite as well that far north. So it was more expensive to use hops. And that's one reason why you see lower hopping rates. So instead, as opposed to the English bitters, which balance more towards the bitterness, the Scottish ales to the north balance more towards the malt sweetness. So what you have is a beer that features more caramel, toasty malt flavors. They might have a hint of roast characteristic, but a low hop bitterness. And uh, and what you see is a wide range of strengths, just like with the English bitters. So with the English bitters, we've got those three distinct designations based on alcoholic strength. And BJCP breaks down these Scottish ales in the same manner. We've got Scottish Light, Scottish Heavy, and Scottish Export. Scottish Light is 2.5 to 3.2 ABV. Scottish Heavy is 3.2 to 3.9. And Scottish Export is 3.9 to 6.0 ABV. So some clear lines of designation along alcoholic strength. And then you get to the top of the ladder with Scottish ales and a beer that we call Wee Heavy. Wee Heavy is also known as a strong Scotch ale. So this would be the strongest of the Scottish ales, and this pretty much picks up that upper end of the alcoholic strength. This is 6.5 to 10.0 ABV. These are some of the richest, strongest beers that a Scottish brewery might likely make. So these are rich, full-bodied beers. They feature caramel and toffee malt flavors. Sometimes they might have a light chocolatey roast or even some dried fruit notes in the malt character. Low bitterness, and sometimes in American versions, you would see some type of smoky character, but this is inappropriate for a traditional Scottish beer. This goes for the lower strength Scottish ales as well as Wee Heavy. A lot of people think that a smoke character is appropriate in these beers, but traditionally it is not. I think there might be some association with Scotch ale with people thinking that it's like Scotch whiskey, which does have that distinct peat smoked malt character. That is not a characteristic of Scotch ale or Wee Heavy or any of the Scottish ales. Okay. Well, that gets us to the end of a handful of beers. I do want to remind you that, uh, I've talked about a handful of these British and Irish styles, but this by no means it covers all of the different beers that you need to be familiar with in order to take and pass the certified beer server exam. So if you're studying for that exam, I would encourage you to refer to the Certified Beer Server syllabus. You can find that on the Cicerone website, download it, and use that as your study guide. And that's going to tell you every single BJCP style that you're responsible for on that exam. So it includes all the ones I've covered today, but there's going to be some other ones in there that you're going to need to be able to talk about as well. So go ahead and download that and check that out, and you'll be more prepared to take the certified beer server exam. So it is question and answer time right now. And this is the point where I promised I would remind you that there is a link to a survey coming up here shortly. There it is, actually. Yeah, certified beer server exam giveaway. Click here. Closes at 3 p.m. Central Time. So if you want to be entered to win a free certified beer server exam, click that link, fill out the survey, enter your email address correctly, and you will be entered to win one of those exams. We're going to give away 10 of them. So go ahead and do that. Open for a short period of time. So when I'm done and this video posts to YouTube, you can still find that link in the description of the video. All right, so I'm going to tackle some of these questions that have been rolling in. Let's see. What's the difference between pale ale and bitter? So bitter is that kind of umbrella term that we use uh, to talk about those different strengths of beer, the different strengths of the English bitters. So we've got that ordinary, we've got the best, we've got the strong bitter, and that strong bitter. All of those, ordinary, best, and strong, are typically draft or cask conditioned beers. The bottled version of the strong bitter is what we would consider to be English pale ale. Pale ale itself is a more umbrella term as well, because it also encompasses the American pale ale, which we'll talk about next week. Why is it called ESB, and what makes the beer special? So ESB, it would also fall under that strong bitter category. Fuller's makes a beer that's called ESB and is widely considered to be the benchmark for what an ESB is. But it largely falls into that category. Special is just a term that was a coin to describe the beer. I don't know if I have much of a story beyond that, to tell you the truth. Okay, and as my Slack here, my questions just are resetting. Here we go. They just came back. I apologize. Let's see. Why do brewers in Scotland use a longer boiling time? Well, actually, if you look at the history of Scottish beers, they don't necessarily have a longer boiling time. Much of the richer malt character in Scottish ales uh, comes from the types of malts that they're using. Although I will say that a longer boiling time, when you do have a longer boiling time, you're going to be caramelizing sugars, and you're going to be producing richer caramel, more toffee-like caramelized flavors in the beer. What exactly is cask conditioned beer? So cask conditioned beer is really a method of service, which you can pretty much only find in the UK. Some American brewers are doing it and doing it correctly, but they're few and far between. So it's a method of service where you have fresh beer right after it's done fermenting, put into a cask, and then it's primed with additional sugar. So it still has yeast in suspension. And then it has a little bit more sugar added. So it undergoes a secondary fermentation in that cask. And that cask is delivered fresh to the tavern. And the cellar master will kind of guide that beer through that secondary fermentation and then assess the carbonation which is produced by that fermentation and assess the condition of that beer. And when it's ready to serve, when it's cleared up and the fermentation is done and it's properly carbonated, then they'll serve it right out of that cask. So it's really fresh beer, uh, as fresh from the brewery and on tap at the bar as you could really get. When it's done right, it's like the freshly baked bread of beer. It's a really wonderful thing. What's the usual malt composition of stouts? So, the base malt for a stout beer is going to be typically some type of pale malt. It'll be pale malt. It may have the addition of some caramel malts or crystal malts potentially. It may have some other base malts mixed in. It might have a little bit of Munich malt potentially. This is going to vary, of course, by the brewer. There's lots of different recipe formulation. And it's going to have some element of roasted malt. So it may have some chocolate malt in there, and it's almost definitely going to have some black malt and or roasted barley. Black malt and roasted barley are the most highly kilned grains that you can get. Roasted barley is very similar to black malt, only it hasn't undergone the malting process before it's been kilned at a high temperature. So those darker malts are going to give you that dark roasted character, and the black malt and roasted barley are going to give you that specifically sharp espresso-like malt character that you should expect from a stout beer. Are all IPAs dry hopped? Well, I would say that that is the case. It's probably the case with American IPA. And even when you go to England nowadays and you visit, a lot of brewers in England, they're making what they're calling American IPA, which is kind of funny because American brewers, are making a beer that is drawing from an English tradition, and now some modern English brewers are drawing from the American brewers who drew from England. So there's this weird kind of complete circle that's being created. But traditional IPA, I think were sometimes dry hopped, but not always. What's the difference between IPA and pale ale? It's a matter of alcoholic strength. IPA is a little bit stronger, but more importantly, IPA has a higher IBU levels. Higher, it's more highly hopped, and it's a more bitter beer. Are there any lager beers in British and Irish beer styles? There are, most of the lager beers you see are international style lagers. BJCP doesn't have a lager category for British and Irish. What's the typical CO2 content of a stout served on nitro? That would be around 1.2 to 1.6 volumes, probably, for most brewers. I don't want to say that as a total blanket statement, but it's very low. What's the best way to describe ESB? I think it's misleading, and people tend to assume it's like IPA bitterness. Well, I think, any beer that is labeled as a bitter may lead, especially American consumers, to think that it's going to be bitter like an IPA, because that's the beer that features bitterness that most Americans are familiar with. But the English bitters, including ESB, um, these are going to have some caramel, toasty, or bread-like malt flavors. Uh, they're going to be low, medium to medium body. They're going to have a prominent or assertive hop bitterness, although not IPA levels of bitterness. The bitterness levels are really just to bring it, kind of tip the balance towards that hop bitterness. So they're present and they're one of the dominant flavors, but they're not really assertive like you would get with IPA. So there's a brewery in LA that often has shilling numbers with number designations. Can you talk a little bit about this? So the shilling numbers were really a designation of strength, but actually they were a designation of the cost of the beer. So as the beers were, so the stronger the beers got, the higher the shilling number, but the more expensive they were. And this was a result of the taxation based on alcoholic content. So the higher the shilling number, the stronger the beer. Let's see. So somewhere I read that Wee Heavy was a nickname. The true name is Scotch Ale, and the lighter versions are named Scottish Ale Light Heavy Export. Is that correct? Well, so I use the term Wee Heavy as the primary term because that's what the most recent style guidelines from the BJCP refer to it as. The previous version of BJCP style guidelines referred to it as Scotch Ale or Wee Heavy. They've excuse me. They've since excuse me. They have since put more weight on the term Wee Heavy. And I think it's important to note that these are the terms, the way we talk about these style names are the way that the Beer Judge Certification Program talks about these style names. It doesn't mean that in everyday usage when you're talking with people that it's wrong to call it a Scotch ale. That just means that this is what BJCP is calling it. And we use those terms specifically because our examinations use those terms as BJCP describes them. So if you're preparing for one of our exams, it's good to know how BJCP is talking about these beers. What are the most common types of hops used in ESBs and English bitters? Some of the traditional English hops like Fuggle or Golding, East Kent Golding would be some commonly used hops in those beers. Let's see. Would you mind talking about lactose being added to more and more beers like milkshake IPA, pastry, sweet stout, etc.? Do you think additional ingredients should be labeled for people with allergies? Um, yeah, lactose up until just a few years ago was really just used in sweet stouts to make the beer more sweet. As we've seen experimentation really push into the New England or hazy IPAs that are a little bit sweeter and less bitter and these fruited beers that are kind of pushing the boundaries of some of these beers as we previously understood them. Lactose is becoming part of those part of the recipe. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I think using different ingredients to make different flavors of beer and create some unique and inventive styles, I think is really cool. That's part of what makes the American brewing industry fun and unique. That spirit of experimentation makes us now some of the leaders in the world in brewing. Using those ingredients, I think, to make different types of beer is just fine. Um, as far as labeling laws and what should be on labels, I think if you have something that's a potential allergen, maybe that's a good idea to put on your labels. I think people should know if they're about to consume something that has something allergenic in it. But I don't want to delve too deep into the political nature of what breweries should or shouldn't be doing with their labeling beyond that. Okay, is barley wine a UK style? Yes, it is. So if we look at the English bitters, we kind of have this ladder, stepping up the ladder of strength with the bitters. And you can keep stepping up that ladder with a similar recipe formulation and creating stronger and stronger beers. And at the top of that ladder would be English barley wine. That would be at the top of the ladder of those English bitters. The English barley wine features a lot of those same malt characteristics: caramel, toffee, maybe some toastiness, breadiness. Only it's really big and full bodied and rich in flavor. There's bitterness in there to help balance that out, but they do differ from the English bitters in the sense that they tend to be a lot more malt focused than hop focused like the bitters. But yeah, that is a UK style. And there is an American barley wine, which is an American adaptation of that style. So if you want to learn more about it, we have a Road to Cicerone British beer style book. I mentioned this on Tuesday when we were talking about German styles. The British Road to Cicerone book is available on the Cicerone website. And we have a series of Road to Cicerone books for people who have already passed Certified Beer Server, or even if you haven't passed Certified Beer Server and want to do some specific study, but they're designed as kind of a stepping stone between Certified Beer Server and Certified Cicerone. And so the purchase of one of those books gets you not just the book, but it gets you access to a specialist exam. And so if you go through the book and then you take the exam and pass the exam, you'll get a little enamel lapel pin that'll designate you as the UK styles expert. And we have these for all of the different beer style categories that we teach, as well as keeping and serving and the brewing process and ingredients. So check that out if you want to learn more about not just barley wine, but about any of the British beers, UK beers, Irish beers that we talked about today. All right, so that gets me to the end. Don't forget to hit subscribe at the bottom and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and check out all the previous webinars that I've done in the CBS Prep Talks series. I want to remind you that tonight with the brewery out of Orange County, California, we several Master Cicerones, including myself, are doing a fun kind of sit around, drink a couple of beers, talk about Cicerone program, talk about Master Cicerone, and talk about beer in general. This is from getting it right here, 5 p.m. Pacific time, or 7 p.m. Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and forget what channel that is going to be on. Maybe somebody can text me real quick the channel that's on. I think it's on YouTube. So look for that. There's some social media posts out there. We'll be posting about that on our social media channels. Also, next Tuesday, we have CBS Prep Talk number 11. This is American beer styles. So Tuesday, May 26th, 1 p.m. Central Time. And I'll be here talking about American beer styles. And then the following Thursday, the 28th, will be our very last one on Belgian beer styles. Again, Thursday, 1 p.m. on the 28th. So I just did get confirmation here that the Master Cicerone talk is on the Brewery YouTube channel. That is Bruery. If you're not familiar with them, it's not spelled like the actual word brewery. So go to the Brewery YouTube channel and you'll have access to that Master Cicerone talk tonight. So that's all I got. Thank you for joining in once again. I really appreciate so many people showing up and listening to me talk about beer. We only got 2 more left. I'll be here, and I hope you will be too. Thank you so much, and cheers, everybody. Until next time.